Hello, and welcome to the session on linking disaster risk reduction into development. For this session, you should be able to understand the relationship between disasters and development and to define mainstreaming. Starting with disasters and development, the first key thing that we have. Now let's look at the linkages between disasters and development. Now, for a long time, the cause and effect relationship between disasters and social and economic development was ignored. Ministry of Planning and Finance and other development partners did not concern themselves too much with disasters. At best, development partners hoped that disasters would not occur, and if they did, were most effectively handled by relief from donor countries and relief organizations. Development programs were also not assessed in the context of disasters, neither from the effect of disaster on the development program, nor from the point of whether the development program increase the likelihood of a disaster or increase the potential damaging effects of a disaster. Disasters were also seen in the context of emergency response, not as part of a long-term development planning. So when a disaster did occur, the response was directed to emergency needs and cleanup. Communities also under disaster distress were seen as unlikely places to institute development. The post-disaster environment was also seen as too turbulent and too complex to provide institutional changes aimed at promoting long-term development. Now, aspects of development and vulnerability to disasters are charted on this figure that you see here. Now, this graphic shows the various orientations in which you may analyze in the field of development and disaster vulnerability. Now, as you see, this field is divided into positive and negative aspects of the disaster and development relationship by the vertical axis. The right half reflects the positive or optimistic side of the relationship, and the left side of the diagram deals with the negative aspects of the relationship. Now, the short statement that you see in each quadrant sums up the basic concepts derived from the overlap of the two realms. For example, on your top left, disasters can increase disaster risk. On the top right, development can reduce disaster risk. On the bottom left, disasters can also set back development. And on the bottom right, disasters can provide development opportunities. Let's start with how disasters set back development programming, destroying years of development initiatives. Now, disaster setbacks development in different ways. For example, on this photo that you see here, it can cause damages to infrastructure as a result of a landslide. In the second photo, livelihood development linked initiatives in this case is loss in livestock which are affected by drought impacts. This photo that you see here is about earthquakes which can cause extensive damages to infrastructure and making the rehabilitation and recovery phases complex. On the last photo, disasters such as floods also pauses the daily life, including impacts on the small and medium enterprises. These examples, depending on the scale and intensity of the disaster impact, can have long-lasting and cumulative economic repercussions. For example, development resources are lost when a disaster wipes out the production of previous investments. The primary loss of development resources naturally occurs from damage to capital stock and inventory. This is initially the most visible effect of sudden impact disasters. Tropical cyclones, for example, can destroy factories, fishing ports, power systems, and telecommunications. Earthquake damages can destroy building, transport, public utilities, and generally disasters have a particularly destructive economic impact in areas where there are very few alternatives for assets, which are destroyed, or in areas where those assets are particularly critical. There is also further loss of development resources from the reduction in the production of goods and provision of services. Now, this results from direct disruption by the disaster and its immediate local effects, and subsequently from the increased cost of goods and services from which then result. Income losses, for example, results from a loss of production, which have a particularly depressing impact on consumers' ability to purchase goods and services. Lost productivity may also result in loss of export markets. For example, a coconut plantation in India lost to cyclone damages will take 5 years to regenerate, during which time other coconut producing countries can increase market share. Development programs can increase an area's susceptibility and vulnerability to disasters. For example, a major increase in livestock development leads to overgrazing, which contributes to desertification and increases vulnerability to famine. Now, in addition, not following or improper building codes and insufficient city planning or land use planning enhances susceptibility and vulnerability to disasters as well. Now, underdevelopment, of course, predisposes a population to the adverse consequences of disasters. At the same time, however, the development process in itself may increase vulnerability to disasters. Now, this reviews the variety of forces which shape the relationship between vulnerability and the character of development activity. There is, of course, a clearly established linkages between poverty, marginalization, overpopulation, and vulnerability. Now, to a large extent, vulnerability derives from poverty. People living in poverty are most likely to live in vulnerable areas. For examples, on slopes which are vulnerable to landslides, or in flood-prone areas on marginal agricultural land. Now, poorer countries, for example, generally are also most likely to have a dangerous building stock, often as a result of inadequate resource to enforce appropriate building codes, in addition to a lack of public awareness and education. A lack of access to education, for example, and information often also has wider implications for vulnerability. People may be simply be unaware of the options they are uh, open to them for vulnerability reduction. In addition, people living in poverty also has fewer assets to invest in resources, which may reduce their vulnerability and may be unwilling to make any significant investment without clear and obvious benefits. In addition, people living in poverty are also less likely to be in a position to organize collectively to reduce risks, partially because poorer groups usually have a higher proportion of people living in vulnerability. Rebuilding after a disaster also provides significant opportunities to initiate development programs. For example, a self-help housing program to rebuild housing destroyed by an earthquake teaches new skills. It also strengthens community pride and leadership and retains development dollars that otherwise would be exported to large construction companies. Now, this is also similar to the concept of building back better, the use of the recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction phases after a disaster to increase the resilience of nations and communities through integrating disaster risk reduction measures into the restoration of physical infrastructure, societal systems, and into the revitalization of livelihoods, economics, and the environment. Disasters can also be a vehicle for major development programs. The political impact, for example, of damage and disruption can be a real catalyst for change. Now, disaster inspired development initiatives are influenced in a number of ways. First two aspects are especially important. First of which, disasters can highlight particular areas of vulnerability, for example, where serious loss of life has occurred, or where the economic damages is disproportionate to the strength of the impact itself. Now, the outcome of this is usually to highlight the general level of underdevelopment. Now, second, for a few weeks or months, the political environment may also favor a much higher rate of economic and social change than before in areas such as land reform, new job training, housing improvements, and restructuring of the economic base. Now, the value of direct international assistance given after disasters may also partially compensate for economic losses, although these amounts are usually rather small in relation to the total loss. Now, early injections of aid rarely constitute more than 10% of the overall losses and are usually considerably less than that. Now, in the following months and years, there may be additional long-term development aid, which would otherwise not have been made available. There may also be long-term benefits from a drastic restructuring of the economy as a result of disasters. For example, small island economies that were previously dependent on a single crop may expand their economic base, often with international assistance. Now, it's important to note that the political impact of damage and disruption can be a wake-up call or a catalyst for change. However, as discussed, these opportunities are often missed or compromised because of the excessive focus on relief and response assistance. Now, on the last quadrant, development programs can be designed to increase the resiliency to disasters. Now, the term disaster mitigation is increasingly applied to measure which reduce economic losses, as well as those which reduce death and injury. Now, to restate the distinction between the two types of mitigation, structural mitigation includes measures to reduce the economic and social impact of disasters and involve construction programs, especially dams, windbreaks, terracing, and other hazard-resistant building. Non-structural mitigation is most commonly used to refer to developing policies and practices, including land use policies, zoning, crop diversification, building codes, and other procedures for forecasting and warning. In a more broader context, non-structural mitigation can also include education, awareness, environmental understanding, community organization, and empowerment strategies. Now, we've seen that mitigation is most effective as part of medium to long-term development programs, which incorporates hazard reduction measures into regular investment projects. Now, under these conditions, risk can be assessed analytically and explicitly in the context of national planning and investment program reviews. The cost effectiveness of specific emergency preparedness measures and hazard reduction activities can also be assessed. Now, there are opportunities to build links between government and international organizations involved in relief and recovery and provide opportunities for investment institutions to help governments gain access to new developments in disaster risk reduction. In regular investment projects, for example, design and sector loans, attention can be given to early warning systems and other elements of emergency preparedness through financial or technical assistance. Now, there is a wide range of options to incorporate mitigation measures into regular development programs. Now, each of the following examples that I will provide will suggest ways of protecting populations and critical economic assets against disasters and of reducing the overall impacts of a disaster. Now, first, for example, is to strengthen urban utility systems and industrial support infrastructure is a common aim of development projects. Now, this is achieved through a variety of external inputs, including loans, technical assistance, and institutional development support. Now, so-called lifeline systems such as water, electric power, transport are all links, transport links and communications can be made more effective as well as more selectively resistant to particular hazards. Investments in transport and communications also improve a country's ability to respond to and recover from a major emergency. For example, improvements in road capacity will usually make evacuation easier. Better communication will often lead to improved early warning and more effective preparedness and response measures. Investments in airports and bridges can help speed up the delivery of relief resources. Now, the second example is that there are usually many opportunities to incorporate hazard-resistant building techniques in housing and other construction programs. These opportunities are usually specific to the type of housing used in the region and the nature of local hazards. Such measures can substantially reduce earthquake and tropical storm deaths and injuries. In addition, these programs can also protect high-value economic resources, reducing the total loss and the total cost of damage, and improving the chances of more rapid recovery. Now, let me break this down between the economic, social, and environmental ways where development can reduce disaster risk. Under economic development, this that can reduce disaster risk by through having a stable economic growth, which may lead to better human development, investment and implementation of disaster risk reduction activities, and greater available resources to cope with and recover from disasters. Under social development, education, literacy, healthcare, and social services make society more resilient to potential impact of hazards. Community members with skills to prepare, respond, and recover from disasters will contribute to reducing casualties and losses. And stable political system and strong community networks are also major factors that increase social capacity. On environmental, natural environment provides protection from natural hazards, provider of valuable resources to meet people's basic needs or as physical mitigation measures. Now, ecological services also and proper use of the natural resource asset and its assets could reduce and or eliminate risk from landslides or flooding. Now, it's important to note that decision makers who ignore the relationships between disasters and development do a disservice to the people who place trust in them. Now, development requires institutional and structural transformations of societies to speed up economic growth, reduce level of inequalities, and eradicate absolute poverty. Now, over time, the effects of disasters can seriously degrade a country's long-term potential for sustainable development and cause governments to substantially modify their economic development priorities and programs. But at the same time, disasters often provide opportunities for development. They can improve the atmosphere in favor of change and create a rationale to establish development programs such as job training, house construction, and land reforms. However, poor management of the relief and rehabilitation responses may have severe negative implications for development for years to come, and even increase vulnerability to future hazards. Now let's talk about the key concepts and recap the key concepts on disasters and development. So the challenge of development is to do better, which is usually done by identifying and developing policies, programs, and projects. Now also the relationship between disasters and development differ from one type of hazard to another. In addition, disasters wear down decades long-term development gains, and development may increase vulnerabilities to natural hazards if it does not take existing and future risks into account. Now, development also needs to be risk sensitive to guarantee its progress, and more importantly, to protect lives and livelihoods of communities at risk. Now, let's try to define mainstreaming. In the context of disaster risk reduction, enhancing and expanding disaster risk DRR so that it becomes a normal practice and fully institutionalized into the national, sectoral, and local development agendas of countries at risk from natural hazards. Now, in the last decade or more, particularly since the inception of the Hyogo Framework for Action in 2005 and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015, there has been increased recognition on the need to mainstream disaster risk reduction into development. That is to consider and address risk emanating from natural hazards in the medium-term strategic framework and institutional structures in country and sectoral strategies and policies and in the design of individual projects in hazard-prone countries. Mainstreaming disaster risk reduction into development means significantly expanding and enhancing DRR so that it becomes a normal practice and fully institutionalized within the national, sectoral and local development agenda of nations at risk. Now, mainstreaming DRR is also a dynamic process with dual purposes. The first purpose is to ensure current and future development is protected through DRR elements. The second purpose is to ensure that current and future development does not increase people's vulnerability to disasters. Now, mainstreaming disaster risk reduction is about making DRR or DRM part of normal development procedures. Now, there are three key purposes for mainstreaming DRR. First being is to make certain that all national, sector, and local development programs are designed with evident consideration for potential disaster risks to resist hazard impacts. The second one is to make certain that all national, sectoral, and local development programs and projects do not inadvertently increase vulnerability to disasters in all sectors, particularly in technical, social, financial, economic, and environmental sectors. The third purpose is to make certain that all national, sector, and development programs and projects are designed to contribute to development aims and to reduce future risks. In development, mainstreaming generally refers to one strategy for dealing with any kind of cross-cutting issues. Now, it is a technique for normalizing the cross-cutting issues as part of development activities. However, mainstreaming is not an end to itself, but rather a cyclical process that can continually be used to further normalize one process as part of the other. Now, mainstreaming DRR into development is also a continuous process to reduce disaster risk through the reduction of exposure and vulnerability. Now, by achieving this, development gains will be protected, including public investments or public programs and projects, will hopefully yield optimal benefits for the country and the people that's possibly at risk as a result of development actions could be minimized. Mainstreaming is importantly not, however, an end in itself, but rather as an approach or means to achieve the overall objectives of reducing risks to natural disasters. Lastly, mainstreaming disaster risk reduction should also reduce in the appropriate measures being taken to reduce disaster risk and ensure that development plans and programs do not create new forms of vulnerability. This is it for the session today. We look forward to discussing this in more detail, including identifying different practices in Asia and the Pacific on how ADPC has been mainstreaming disaster risk reduction and development. Now, ADPC has over more than 15 years of experience in supporting member countries in mainstreaming disaster risk reduction into the development process. So we look forward to presenting this to you when we meet each other face to face. Thank you very much, and we look forward to welcoming you in Bangkok, and have a safe flight.